Welcome back to Chainmakers, where we sit down with people pushing the boundaries of what crypto can do. I'm Brittany Lachlan, chairman at the Sachs Foundation, and today I'm joined by Scott Sigel, CEO of the Helium Foundation, which is the project creating one of the largest decentralized wireless networks in the world. Scott's been a key operator in the protocol's transition to Solana, helped unlock new applications of Helium beyond Internet of Things, and continues to push for scalable, usable crypto infrastructure. He's also been a great mentor to me in the growth of Web3. So thank you, Scott. But today we'll learn about what does it take to coordinate thousands of physical network contributors, navigate protocol governance, and onboard users to crypto-powered connectivity. So welcome, Scott, to Chainmakers.
Thank you for having me. I don't know if you can give me that much credit as a mentor. I'll take it. But no, Brittany, thanks for having me on and super excited to be chatting today.
Yeah, I'd love to kick off just like a little bit, the short version of what was your path into crypto? Because you've been working with the Helium Foundation for a number of years now, but how did you get here?
Yeah, definitely lattice, not ladder. I started my career really in much more traditional, I call it Web 2 venture. But, as we kind of get in the conversation, like there's so many analogs to two-sided marketplaces from, I kind of bring these kind of same principles into crypto. But yeah, very traditional venture scaling, companies in fintech space, consumer space, payments. It's been a while on that side. Actually, funny enough, so however, really kind of that transition to crypto, I was in the middle of kind of winding down a startup, and I knew the folks over at Silicon Valley Bank pretty well, or SVB, and it was they were always great network connectors, and they had a little bit of this like DNA around like bringing like operator and residence type people to go work with early founders. I'm like, oh, I'll go spend a few months here. End up sticking around for like 3 years doing stuff with the R&D team around open banking, and there was actually just generally a good culture there. But I remember kind of that first wave of crypto founder in New York of, hey, I just can't even get a bank account open. And just through those conversations, starting to dig in more of like, what is actually getting built here and getting excited about the space. I mean, this is back in like the early teens. And I always loved the principles around it of, it was open networks and permissionless systems and user autonomy, sovereignty over data. Just it really felt very kind of you're getting the Web 1 principles, but finding with like an economic model around it. So it's always fascinating to me from both a coordination perspective, capital formation, that when I knew I was just frankly getting bored being at S&B, I'm like, okay, I finally need to stop sitting in a cushy job. As soon as I went out to go and start building something else, at least two founders that I had known in the crypto space, they were, no, I need you over here. Come work with me. And that was how I got my start. It was a deep technical team, traditional cryptography background, and they were building. This is back when like exchange hacks were like the biggest thing in the teens of like don't keep your money there, and DeFi wasn't a thing yet. DEXs were like just starting to come on the scene. Like Shapeshift was like one of the first things that was kind of like innovating in that space, and it was how do you kind of trade from custody. This team had built like a cross-chain atomic swap. I don't know if you remember atomic swaps. Like that's an old thing to bring up, but yeah, kind of going and working with this team and getting the opportunity to like go to scaling Bitcoin in Tokyo and definitely being like the least technical person in the room, but at least working with these kind of protocol designers and architects and how do you rethink what do these kind of financial systems look like, but also starting to get into more of these how do you build communities, how do you think about incentive models, how do you think about how these systems are all governed. Yeah, kind of went right in from that side of it, and it's just a fun and intellectually stimulating winding path of like that kind of DeFi primitives to after a couple of years on that, end up doing a couple projects, one with the Arweave team, was actually early on kind of the Solana team right around the kind of like mainnet launch. Um, which was funny because I think Ben Sparango was just tweeting out something this morning of like it was during the wormhole hackathon of like if like remember back when, and it was like, oh my god, that feels like ages ago now, and it's only like what 5-6 years history. But ultimately landed at Helium one, I always just it was the thing to me, like first it was like this, like they had kind of consumerized mining. Like I was just so fascinated by the idea of like Bitcoin, Ethereum at that point, like you needed some amount of technical know-how, but the fact that Helium was so tactile, the idea that it was kind of really core, and I think that Helium gets a lot of credit as this kind of inspiring the deep in space of, well, how do you coordinate this idea of building physical infrastructure? And crypto enabled it in the way that traditional banking rails never did. So yeah, kind of came in to start up the foundation, and it's been an absolutely ups and downs, but such a rewarding experience, such a great project to be working on. The fact that the network's now hitting its stride, it's such an exciting time. But yeah, it's been such a winding journey to get here, but wouldn't trade it.
Yeah, well, just watching Helium go from idea to, hardware to now this like network that people can use. So check it out if you haven't yet. So, looking at sort of your bio on the Helium Foundation, you talk about educating the public on what's possible at the intersection of wireless networks and blockchain technology. That's kind of the vision for Helium. Maybe you can sort of summarize like what is possible there and why is it so exciting?
And it's funny too, like, nearly 5 years in, how much of that, like, we're still doing that work on a regular basis. I mean, at all different levels. Like, I was in DC last week, and how much we still need to. It's kind of like it's important. I think this is a great lesson for just founders. You're like holding yourself accountable to the like constantly explain like I'm five. Like, if we're really trying to bring the economic benefits of blockchain and crypto to the masses. Like, we either got to dumb it down or completely abstract it away in general. But anyway, yeah, so back to your question of why is it an exciting space? So if you look at the wireless space, like, why does Helium need to exist at all? Like, what is the, like, why care? So telco's facing a scalability problem, both a CapEx and OpEx problem. So you might hear these things of like, oh, marketing lingo of like, it went from 3G to 5G. What does that actually mean? It means more bandwidth demand. We went from checking email to now streaming videos to now like AI inference at the edge. You just need a lot more data to run through, and that higher bandwidth means more radios out there. And those radios, so you think about like the cell towers that you either see on the side of a building in the city, or you're driving around and you kind of see the what's kind of commonly referred to as like the three on a tree, where it's up in a tower somewhere, and you just need more and more and more of those. And the problem is owning those towers is expensive. Operating them, maintaining them is a like multi-billion-dollar problem. And a lot of that's shouldered by the telcos. There are a couple of companies in the States, American Tower, Crown Castle, that are kind of like that. That is their core business. So they basically buy the real estate, they lease out space to the telcos. But scaling that is incredibly difficult from a centralized model because you're spending billions on billions, and like, what is the return on that investment over time? And the fact that you need so much more density, it's really a problem that not just at the telco level, but like absolutely at the user and the kind of subscriber level of, you're dropping calls. It's because like there's just not enough radios, or the radios don't have enough capacity. So telco is always built top down. Helium is really unlocked the way of how do you do that from the ground up. While yes, there's a disruptor play, it's actually very, very symbiotic. Like, these things work together. AT&T, Telefonica, like two of the biggest names in telco, are actively roaming and using the Helium network because of how much that supply side created at a community level benefits their footprint, benefits that, kind of their subscribers at a lower cost too. You're talking about like something that to the tune of 20 to 25% of the traditional offload cost. You're getting that through the Helium network. So the fact that this was a legacy infrastructure problem, you kind of have a customer waiting there on the demand side to actually use this thing. This is true for energy networks and kind of how you balance kind of that real load of electricity use. How do you build those energy networks to complement the traditional centralized model? Same with compute, same with a lot of the content delivery networks. Like, a lot of these things, this is where kind of like DeepIn's solving this problem of the centralized model to scale these things is running into its own like kind of financial constraints. So how do you actually kind of match that top down model with bottoms up, where you're getting better economics, you're spreading the wealth around a lot more too, just because crypto's that incentive model means just that value accrues so much more broadly. So you're incentivizing more participation. So that's why I think it's so exciting. Like, it's solving truly like a real physical world problem where you can unlock a benefit where this should be, and we're kind of seeing that already as a tide raising all boats kind of initiative.
So how hard was it then to balance protocol incentives with real world demand? All these customers are there.
Yeah.
Because obviously in crypto, we see gaming, we sell these different things, but you have a real physical service you're delivering in some ways, and then you're working with these very large players. So what was that journey like? Because I know it wasn't simple.
No, oh my, I mean, this is kind of the first mover advantage is not necessarily true here. And, it's been lessons learned, and it's crypto, which means you're really, everybody's seeing how the sausage is made, which, by the way, one of the things, anytime I'm talking to, another founder, somebody else in the deep in space who's like kind of just launching, or they've got their token generation events coming in the next, so, it's how much communication expectation setting matters so much in this case. And we can get into more like the feelings around progressive decentralization in general, but like how much that kind of the common expectation setting matters. But to your question, like, Helium went through a journey of, so first, Helium, I meant to kind of start with this, but Helium was not a blockchain project from the get-go. The founding team, which, they're Nova Labs, they were really trying to think about a better way to build IoT or Internet of Things networks, which are like very, very difficult to build. And the economics around IoT is difficult because you're not sending gigabytes of data. You're sending bytes and maybe kilobytes because it's small packets. It's these low power, long range devices that are great for physical asset tracking or air quality metrics or flood monitoring, like those types of things. Those networks are tough to build. So that's what like the original founding team was working on that. They unlocked it. Well, wait a minute, we can actually build out a much bigger supply if we create a larger participation with the incentive. So it started with a focus on IoT and two big lessons early on, again, like looking at hindsight 2020. One was kind of this idea of, like flattening the emissions curve and not necessarily like lowering your emissions to early holders. Like you want them to feel that, they're invested in a potential future and there is kind of like incentives, rewards, and an upside here. Like Helium, just to be like really honest about, like we gave away a little bit too much too quickly. And I think everybody kind of knows that. And again, we were one of the early players in the space. So like, how do you think about flattening out your emissions for like kind of long-term durability? And like, I think we've solved for that now, but it would have given us an advantage to think about like those economics and like the incentives early on. So, and I think a lot of that's the storytelling and the communication where people have that buy-in in addition to the economics. The other thing that was really hard for us was IoT is just a brutally, brutally fragmented industry. So while we had, network launched in 2019, 2020, you saw like a real takeoff on the supply side because we opened up to so many manufacturers, but there wasn't really a flagship demand product. And that was not something that was kind of like leading growth to get, again, like this is like two-sided marketplace principles of you build up your supply side, like what is that flagship thing that is getting the supply side participants so excited where they're seeing that use, that demand side pressure? And that's a hard thing in IoT because it's either very hobbyist or you've got a lot of like white glove, very expensive consultants who piece together all these different fragmented hardware and software components. And, there was an easy way to use the network, but there wasn't necessarily like one key thing that like everybody who had a hotspot could immediately go buy like something to use the network with. Like there was a couple different things. So I think that made it challenging in the early days. Fast forward to once we kind of like, oh, we can use this exact same model to really build like mobile and cellular networks. That was actually kind of like very much a community driven. There's another company called Freedom Fi that was ultimately acquired by Nova. They kind of brought this idea and like, well, we're trying to build this and we actually have ways of doing these open networks and like, how do we just leverage the same incentive model? Then it became a real unlock of, well, the easiest way to use the mobile network is just a carrier. It's a use case in every single person's pocket. It's so comprehensible. It's easy. And that unlocked a lot of ways for us to almost like kind of dog food our own network of like launching, so Nova Labs launched a carrier, again, like foundation separate from Nova, but like kind of sparing all the nuance and details. Launching a carrier showed like this network works. Here's a way to interact with it. And then as the conversations with larger telcos started, you could kind of prove it already existed, it already worked because like within our ecosystem, we had built out that carrier ourselves. So I think that that's really kind of core. And I think at this point, when I look at all the other kind of like deep ends that are building and launching, a lot of the real strong ones are coming out of the gate with that flagship demand side product to match up as supply grows. So that I think is just kind of so, that again, it's true for any two-sided marketplace, but especially in something like crypto where you've got these 24/7 markets and you've got such kind of a low attention span to these things. It's like, what's the new hot thing? You kind of need to validate so quickly. And it's hard. Like I think about traditional venture 10, 15, I can age myself 20 years ago. You had that time to validate. And now like you got to be proving it like pretty fast. So I think that's like really important right now of how much you can kind of like validate that kind of the network's utility. Um, really right out of the gate and kind of serving the promise that you're kind of delivering to the public.
Yeah, well, deepen is like definitely like the hot sort of topic. I feel like, is it like deepen summer? Are we in deepen year? But with deepen, like what other advice would you have for founders? You said sort of like lower, have like the longer tail emissions curve, but are there other things you you see like either mistakes people are making or things that you're like, this is how I would do it if I were to launch this again or start a new.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. I mean, obviously, yes. Like, so I think like thinking about the economics and kind of like flattening your emissions curve. That's one thing. We talked about building demand alongside supply. I think that so another thing, and I alluded to this earlier, is this idea of progressive decentralization because of the fact that you I think it's great for these networks to be open and permissionless and aim for those things and kind of talk about like what is the path of how you're going to get there. But you need to, as a network, as an ecosystem, thinking like UX still matters in this stuff. Quality of service still matters. And the more that you start to spread that out, the more you don't have, especially in the early days of the network, you don't have control over that as much. So setting those baseline standards for, if you're, and I'll talk specifically about DeepIn, like if you've got, there's hardware because you're talking about you're creating there's a physical footprint here. You're kind of building these physical networks and like they're great network effects because physical networks are the hardest ones to actually like unseat. But we had, I think at one point almost 3 dozen manufacturing partners, and oh, I would not do that again. Like you kind of have to have like what is the baseline performance, and once you establish that, and you want to start to bring in more partners, well, you need accountability. Like you want contractual relationships because you want to be able to kind of monitor and manage the quality of the network from all angles. Even if you're trying to kind of spread a lot of those responsibilities around, as a network founder, as a network steward, like that responsibility still comes back to you. I mean, I remember, 3, 4 years ago, if we had a hardware partner that was not delivering on their service appropriately, like there was a customer service issue, we could talk about decentralization all we want of how much like, hey, that's their product, it's their customer service, you need to take it up with them. Of course it's going to come back to us. Like we're the network stewards. Like it was, perception is reality. So as far as the community was concerned, if we didn't hold them accountable, it was on us. So, you can talk about open networks all you want, but again, us, like the importance of having those contractual relationships and obligations, which we were a little bit late on doing that, I'll be honest. That kind of has to start from day one because thinking about quality, thinking about UX, like you don't want to kind of spread the workload around until you have what feels like the right baseline and how you're operating. So I think that you want to talk about your path to, yeah, and even when you're talking about a path to decentralization, in service of what? Like to me, is like, is the network neutral in such a way that anybody operating on top of that is all playing by the same rules of the game? That there's not some dominant ownership where if one organization wanted to completely change the economics of the network, they can do so. That kind of puts any other commercial player at a disadvantage. I think it's that amount of neutrality that like anybody who's receiving the rewards and the incentives, like all that stuff it's transparent, you can understand it. And how do you get to like that optimal open state, but to kind of get out of the gate of giving up too much control, spreading it too thin? It creates so much operational overhead that a lot of the like end product stuff and the end network benefit, you're going to struggle to do that because you just spread yourself, your team, and your ecosystem so thin on managing all these other stakeholders. So, yeah, you kind of almost need to like keep that. I hate to use this word, but like, you kind of need to keep that Web 2 mentality of like, it's not control for the sake of economic control, it's quality control. And if that is like a core principle to your team, to your network, to your community, then you can talk about your path to how you get there and kind of like think about those milestones of where you want to start to give up some of the control around governance or bring that to a governance council of 12 people or to 12 organizations before you start to kind of spread yourself too thin on that. So I think that's really, really important of just like keeping your eye on the ball around quality control because otherwise you can be decentralized all you want, but if the thing's not working or that experience is not great, then you're gonna have a hard time driving your demand side. It's
Very
tough
solid.
balance. It's really it's such a tough balance. Like I have so much sympathy for the folks who like are thinking about that like intellectual honesty around how much of the network is managed or controlled or governed or like who's kind of like running some piece of firmware. But you have to make the thing work. Like while you're incentivizing a larger community, like help you build up that network and like just think about the path to getting there and like just keep doing that kind of, steelman exercise or keep doing those kind of white hat exercises of like where are the risk vectors and like how could we be gamed? But yeah, you kind of almost need to launch with like a little more control than you might be comfortable with, but just make sure get to that like neutral network state and talk about how you're going to get there. Um, so yeah, it's a tough. It really is a tough balance. I don't think anybody's kind of like cracked it perfectly.
Yeah, well, it's like governance is always changing. So, like, I'm curious how, today, given what you've learned, how you approach governance within your network. Is it, like what's sort of the structure for governance and like how are decisions made then at scale within either the foundation or through Nova or how that power kind of balances out?
Yeah, so it again the ways that we've had the pendulum. So Helium aspirationally launched with such an open governance model, and I mean like very early days, like nothing was on chain. It was a lot of like rough consensus that we were running through Discord, and it was just like a lot of like kind of thought exercise, like what felt directionally appropriate. And then, the protocol team was like kind of steering those things, but the community had a ton of input. And we evolved to more of an on-chain mechanism where people were voting with their wallets. And again, like this is any HNT holder. I'm sorry, HNT is the native token for the network. Any HNT holder could participate. So you had the opportunity for broad participation. And it was funny. I remember the discussions of, is it one hotspot, one vote? Is it one wallet, one vote, or one token, one vote? And, I always go back to, at least me personally, of like one token, one vote, because like the how invested economically you are in the network kind of like that's your skin in the game to me. And I know a lot of people were kind of frustrated, well, it was all about like one hotspot, one vote, but like the reality is like you have to balance the stakeholders on both your supply and demand side. If AT&T is one of the biggest users of the network and they're invested deeply economically, well, you want them to have a voice in kind of, whether it's technical or economic properties of that network. Anyway, the reality of these things is that a lot of it kind of has to come down to alignment. I think that um, you know, the future of these networks to me really, and I know there's a piece that A16Z put out not long ago, like, is the era of foundations dead or not? And I read that and I was kind of, half of those things like I absolutely I felt in line with. The other half, I think you still need that amount of stewardship. But one of the things that is when I look at future state of these networks, when you have enough commercial interest to leverage like these community built networks, if you will, that's kind of who like has the most skin in the game. Like that's truly what is driving their business and allowing it to operate. So I feel like if you're really looking towards future state, kind of this like commercial consortium is kind of it feels like the right way to govern these networks and kind of the end state of those things. Foundations are kind of great, like mid-state stewards, because they're thinking about how they support the community. They're thinking about, like they're kind of supposed to be facilitating like a strong feedback loop within the community, but ultimately that community is a lot of your supply side builders and deployers, and like you're probably, and you have eyes into where that demand side pressure is coming from, but ultimately you want to get to a place where like the most active commercial users of the network, probably the ones that should be the best place to govern that. Obviously making sure that anybody on your supply, like anybody who's building and kind of deploying, like, the economics still need to work for them, otherwise these things don't exist. But in this kind of like messy middle state, what I found with Helium and what I do see in these other networks is like it's really the protocol team that has the most skin in the game, because they're building out commercial products, because they have such a large holding of the tokens, that they're driving a lot of the change. They're doing a lot of the work. I mean, writing, they're writing the code, they're building product. So what we felt like we were seeing a lot was the protocol team was kind of looking at here's the next iteration on like a technical change or an economic change, and kind of looking for community buy-in. It was almost a little bit lopsided, to be honest. And I think this point gets contentious because communities feel like they're, not as in control of the network. But the reality is, you kind of want to put the protocol team front and center and allow them to lead it. You can have that community pushback, but instead of a community voting affirmatively, what we have kind of moved over to is something where here is it's more of kind of like governance by roadmap. This is the change for this month, and voice an objection or voice your alternative proposal in line with that. So it becomes very protocol team driven, as opposed to a little bit more of a community consensus model. At least for Helium, and I think this is true for a lot of DPINs, is you have a fairly centralized kind of like protocol development operation. Looking at some of these other larger L1s where you have, I mean, again, Bitcoin's kind of the gold standard of it, is like very decentralized protocol development there. So you kind of, that makes sense to still have that consensus model of, like, are people updating to this next version or not? And you can kind of like, that's where the code is law works better there. I think that for kind of deep ends where you've got kind of protocol driving, like the reality is for a lot of these things, when you look at the different kind of forms of governance of like, is somebody else writing code right now? Typically not. Usually it's that kind of core protocol team that's sitting under one roof or maybe between a foundation and an opco, which we had as our case for a long time. You kind of need to kind of trust and allow that process to just kind of like run where the community can still vote to affirm those changes and adopt that next version of the protocol. But until another team is stepping in as a commercial user and contributing code, I think that a lot of it becomes a little bit of it's for optics. It's a little bit of theater sometimes, and I think a lot of people don't like to hear that or don't want to talk about it. But that I think that is like the harsh reality of until you've got another commercial design team running code, a lot of it becomes theater. So that's where we've kind of gone back to what does feel and candidly is a little bit more centralized, but you do have the community is still voting to affirm every single month those protocol changes because it does give those deployers a voice. It gives the supply side a voice and like thinking about those economics and how we continue to evolve the governance of Helium. But yeah, that's what's we have found to be most efficient and it's serving us better, at least for this point in history. And again, like I'm sure it'll continue to evolve.
So in there, you said a point about, the end of foundations. Do you imagine there would be a sunsetting of foundation and eventually would turn over to like a consortium? I'm just curious because having built a foundation in Web3, it's kind of like, what is the end state of this? Like, when do we know that this work is done, or is it kind of like a perpetual, or does it evolve? So I'm just curious your hot takes on.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion on this kind of changed a few years ago to like our goal. I do think kind of the foundation's long-term goal is, that it doesn't have to exist. So think about the roles of a foundation. So if you've got something like governance, again, do you have enough other contributors to make sure there are, sufficient points of view on how you're kind of evolving the network from a governance perspective? I think the advocacy and education, again, if you have enough commercial for-profit players that are using the network that benefit from the network that you've got a strong enough kind of supply side deployer that have it's almost I don't want to call it unionized but like effectively enough of like a an organized voice of the supply side plus the demand side, but those things kind of work in concert enough to um, speak to, whether that is the public sector, the private sector benefits. If that work is kind of happening organically because the economic incentives are there, then that's one less job for a foundation to be doing. Similarly with grants, again, like grants exist to really subsidize and create incentives beyond what the protocol already does. So if the protocol incentives aren't enough to drive more development, more deployment, more educational tools, more resources, more kind of, technical tooling, if that stuff is all built because again like there's a commercial alignment for it, like all of these jobs start to disappear over time because these companies rely on the network's existence, they want to maintain it themselves, or they there's enough work that is now being spread and it's done at enough of a professional level that each of these kind of roles for the foundation goes away because somebody else has taken that on. They're doing it in a robust professional fashion. So yeah, I do think at some point you don't need a foundation anymore, but that's certainly not right now. I think about the fact of how much work we are still doing to educate legislators and regulators is incredibly important. The fact that we still go and talk to municipalities, other industry benefit groups, for me to get in front of a number of municipal leaders on here's what we can do to kind of improve connectivity in your city, or from an industrial perspective, making sure that the far reaches of telco understand we are able to work together with you on this thing. Like all of that kind of evangelism, all that education still kind of stewards and runs through foundations. I think that's true through a lot of deep. And so there's still plenty of work to do, but I can see through to the future of where, there just isn't a need for foundation because the incentives are there enough that all of the work that we've kind of done and continue to do will be sustained just in time. So yeah, I think that there will be a sunsetting, but I don't know if that's 5 years or is that 10 years, probably closer to the latter, but we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now that we're going a little forward looking, I want to hear about, where you see this going in, for telcos, for connectivity, or even other things that you've seen people build in Helium, and they're kind of like creating a new visual of what the future looks like from like where you sit, getting to see all this stuff come to life.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously exciting. I think what's really the light bulb goes over a telco executive's head much faster than it does talking to when we're down in DC and talking to the folks down there, um, because they understand it. It's what Airbnb did for hospitality, they completely understand this is what Helium is doing for wireless radios. Or kind of same thing again, like energy networks, compute networks. Like there is something that is supplementing my coverage footprint that I can just kind of rent from them a lot cheaper than I'm paying to somebody else. So I think in the telco space, most of our activity right now is US and Mexico. So what's coming next is obviously more international expansion. I am very excited that we've got a number of pilots that are going, South America, Asia, Southeast Asia, where once you get a couple logos in, once you can start talking about AT&T and Telefonica, like more are going to come out of the woodwork. So, obviously thrilled and happy to see that kind of level of adoption and innovation happening within the US. And now where we can kind of take this model and bring it to other telcos overseas. What's extra exciting is the fact that, Helium's kind of flagship success right now. So started with, the carrier, and now most of the data that is running through the network is actually through what's called offload. And that's exactly the idea, like a large enterprise telco roaming into Helium's network for larger footprint in a more cost-effective fashion. By the way, for what it's worth, for people who are listening, this is incredibly common. It's not a crypto thing. Like there are standards that already exist of, if you're a AT&T customer and you're at a football stadium, you're at the airport, typically you're not actually on AT&T's network. They are paying somebody else for that radio, that real estate to roam in. And again, in the US, like that can be $2 to $2.50 per gigabyte, but like this is an incredibly common standard. It's just the idea of Helium's inserted itself in a way that, when you're talking about 50 cents a gig, that becomes pretty compelling. And that we are also innovating on something where, and this is a little bit less of a crypto thing. It's a wireless thing, but arguably talking about innovating in the space that we're serving is way more exciting than any blockchain innovation for us because it means what we're doing is working and it's interesting. So usually in the wireless space, when somebody like a telco goes and buys or kind of like is buying that data through offload, in a shopping mall, any other indoor facility, they don't necessarily know like the metadata around that of like every single little access point in that mall. Like, what's the uptime? What's the bit rate? What's the throughput? So it's kind of like a black box. They're just saying, well, I'll roam in and I'll pay for that data because like my subscribers are in there, but they don't actually have a lot of the kind of finer nuanced data. This is actually something that we're doing really well, and we're bringing it to these like other wireless steward organizations, so like the Wireless Broadband Alliance, where like we're actively participating. We're talking about more of this, like we call it quality of service metrics, and this is such a like exciting moment for them that again for us to be exciting the wireless industry means like like we're doing something right. So to kind of take what we're building as a standard and now other corporates, other enterprises are trying to adopt the same thing. It means that we're actually innovating in the space that we're serving, which is the right place for us to be innovating. Like we shouldn't be just kind of it should be things just work on the blockchain side. The crypto is doing what it needs to incentivize, the build out of the network and the use of the network. But all the innovation happening on wireless is like what we can and should be doing, and we are doing. So to see that happening, it's so promising for what's next because it means that we're actually not just delivering a cheaper product or a more cost effective one, rather, it is something that is bringing additional value in the data, in the comprehension of how these networks are used and built and kind of managed. So that part's really exciting. I think as we have these conversations with other telcos overseas, it's not just, oh, I want to use you for that roaming and that offload. They kind of see what we're doing with our own carrier with Helium Mobile, and they're realizing how much there is a lot more that you can actually do here. And not to go too deep on it, but like actually as a native carrier on the networks, Helium Mobile, go sign if you're in the US and you're not signed up for Helium Mobile, hellohelium.com, go sign up, get yourself you can do the free phone plan. There's I think like a $10-15 one. Go use it, whether so you need a separate work phone. If you already have a phone, you don't want to give it up, use it as a separate work phone. I always tell anybody who's like an Uber driver, anybody who's doing gig economy stuff, great second phone. So I would tell everybody, go sign it up. Uh, the fact that all of these Helium mobile subscribers, when they're out there using their phone, number one, it's a hell of a lot harder to SIM swap on those phones. So you're more protected from a security perspective, but you're also mapping the network. And this is what's really interesting to the carriers is because anybody who's out there, I'm on, Helium mobile subscriber, I'm out, I'm kind of walking on Third Avenue or Park Avenue, New York. I'm telling the carrier how good the service is where I am. And that allows any carrier to be much more strategic with where they need additional deployments. So we call it footfall in our network, but it's the idea of where's coverage good, where's it bad, where should we make sure that we are talking to deployers? Hey, we need a lot more coverage in Union Square there's just too much, there's a lot of density of people, the users, the dropped calls. All of that information is so important and useful for carriers because it just means that deploying more coverage is less of a guessing game. So the fact that carriers are actually seeing the stuff that we're doing with Helium Mobile, it's like there's another additional, like, oh, you want to engage deeper? Like there's more you can do here. There's actually ways that you can leverage your subscribers. And not like like Helium Mobile is not mining data, all the like text calls, like everything is like encrypted as it normally would be. So it's less about anything that's predatorial. It's more about the data, like the quality of those calls and the quality of that data consumption that carriers want to know. So that end customer experience is as good as it could be. So we're really raising the bar as a network and as a carrier for what wireless connectivity could be. So really a ton of exciting things that are going on. Again, like obviously we're talking a lot about mobile. IoT is still out there. Like there's still like a lot of like really, really cool, exciting use cases that the IoT side is using. Again, I think the economics of IoT make it hard to scale that side of the network, but the kind of municipal and industrial good that comes from flood detection, air quality, better tracking of physical goods in transit, that stuff is all great. And like the fact that we had a team deploy, I think it was the wildfires last year, there was a team called Torch. They were deploying sensors for kind of like better wildfire detection. They barely had to deploy any additional helium gateways because the coverage was it was there. It was great. It worked. So it's still out there. I think the use case narrative around it's great, but like in terms of the economics of the network, like mobile was just absolutely growing like gangbusters. So exciting on kind of all fronts right now.
Awesome. I can't wait for it to come to Europe so I can try it out.
I can't tell you we're running a trial right now, but we are, we're underway.
Sign up for it. Well, I asked this question to all our guests. How do you think AI is going to impact what's coming down the pipe with this? I mean, obviously, AI uses a lot of data in order to build its models. I would imagine that things related to sensors and IoT could actually be very beneficial. But are there other ways that you see that kind of converging with the work that you're doing and it will change in a radical way or not? Or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I can't give as much of the engineering perspective. Obviously, like, and this is true for, any technical organization of the lift that you get from these kind of like these agents that are helping to kind of like build, iterate, scale. Obviously, there's a lift from the kind of like engineering side of the protocol. The reality is, and it's kind of a vanilla answer, but it's like it's true. All of these agents, all these robots, anything that is kind of the labor side of AI or the kind of geographic specific inference, like you need the connectivity at the end of the day. Like, so the ability for these things, the fact that you have as an organization or as an individual, the agency and the incentive to go deploy that coverage where you need it. When you're thinking about kind of future AI and, is it, you've got robots loading things that are coming into port. Well, was there enough coverage there? Anything in the kind of supply chain. So for all these kind of AI things in motion, or where there's like some geographic dependency there, you're no longer blocked by a large carrier that's like, well, they haven't deployed coverage there, or you got to go invest, 500K or $1 million because you need them to kind of wire out and like create the coverage. That you have that ability to create that coverage on the ground where you need it for all these types of AI-driven solutions. All of these things at the end of the day, like have to talk to the internet one way or another. So the fact that you can supplement, create that additional resiliency and redundancy for those things, the fact that you can like it unlocks you from like those bandwidth constraints. You could just open that up when your ability to deploy your own coverage and kind of create your own wireless around it. So yeah, it's kind of a more vanilla answer, but I think that it's just like all the stuff's got to talk to the internet, and if you don't have that connectivity, it's kind of like base layer infrastructure that's critically important to all these things. That's probably where Helium kind of comes in against that like last mile connectivity for all of these things that are kind of like physical world solutions.
And just for people who are listening that maybe don't know, can you talk a little bit about those sensors? People can sort of buy, deploy sensors. What is that like? What are the sort of the incentives for those?
Yeah, I mean, I will say the easiest way to interact with the Helium network, if you're curious, is obviously, subscribing through Helium Mobile, putting up a hotspot and creating that coverage and like kind of participating in the network actively. The IoT side of things, so it runs on something that's called the LoRaWAN standard. There are a number of places that you can, I mean, again, like I tell people don't even like kind of, search anymore. Like if you literally plugged in like what sensors are compatible with Helium networks, just like send it to Chat GPT because like that's going to give you like the best output of like actually use these things. But there are a number of teams that are out there that also provide like really great solutions, like Lone Star Tracking down south. They do like some fantastic stuff. Like they work directly with commercial operators. So there's a lot of like cool things you can do from a hobbyist perspective. And we've got docs in that, we've got Discord. If you're more on kind of commercial user of the network, Green Metrics, Lone Star, Track Pack, like there's a lot of cool things that you can kind of check out, and a lot of that stuff you can kind of dig in and find it on helium.com. Yeah, IoT definitely requires like some amount of tinkering. There's not a ton, and this is not even a Helium thing, like LoRaWAN, which is like that, like kind of low power, long range standard. They don't have a ton of out of the box projects. If you want to build one, by the way, if you think you could build a turnkey LoRaWAN project, I don't know how many like IoT enthusiasts are listening right now. I have grant dollars that I will gladly give you for turnkey IoT like solutions that run on Helium. It's a tough, very nuanced skill set, and it's not the biggest audience out there. But we've got an IoT working group that meets every Monday. Come and join that again. Like it's right in the calendar on the Helium Discord. But I love the diversity of use case there right now. I think that it's still there's still friction on that side of the network, and we want to solve for it. We're investing in where we can improve the use of the IoT network, but the reality is, right now, I think it's like over 95% of protocol revenue comes from the mobile side of the network. So that's where like we're really prioritizing a lot of like the development time, the capital deployments, the support on that side of the networks. Yeah, kind of. I mean, you kind of have to balance of like what is actually driving revenue, what's making sure the network sustains the most. It is certainly in the mobile at this point, but from foundation side, like we're certainly still like anything that comes in on IoT, we're there and eager to support it.
Great use of grant dollars.
Please take my money.
That's awesome. Okay, well, where else can people find you if they have more questions? You've sort of told us where we can go learn about Helium, the Discord, but where can they find you?
Yeah, so I need to be so much better about being active on Twitter/X, but just just at Scott Sigel, no cool and on name there. So I'm there. I think DMs are open. If any questions around kind of foundation, if you're curious about grants, if you just kind of like want to help build the network, if you've got like any deep ties into telco and you love crypto and you want to kind of help us out, like hello@helium.foundation is a great place to start. Always looking for where we can kind of work with teams that have kind of on the ground capability. Like I think things are going great in the US and Mexico, but we're really excited about international growth now that we've like kind of unlocked the sweet spot for Helium here. So yeah, I'd say reach out. Those are probably the best two places. Check out, helium.com. That's more of like if you're curious about the network itself, the economics, how you can actually help provide coverage. Hello, helium.com, more on the carrier side. But I think those are all great places to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining today, and I look forward to signing up for Helium Mobile really soon.
All right, thanks for having me on, Brittany.